Beloved hearts, there comes a moment in every human life when the weight becomes too heavy, when the night feels longer than our strength, and the questions rise louder than the answers. It is in that moment, not when we are strong, not when the path is clear, but when we are tired, trembling, and unsure, that we must learn the sacred act of placing everything into God's hands. You see, we were never designed to carry the whole world on our shoulders. We were shaped for courage, yes, but not for control. We were created for faith, not for fear dressed up as responsibility. So many of us wake each morning gripping tomorrow with clenched fists, trying to manage outcomes we cannot see, trying to heal wounds we did not cause, trying to force doors that were never meant to open by human strength alone. And all the while God waits, not impatient, not angry, but steady. With open hands, God says, "Give it to me. Give me the worry that steals your sleep. Give me the grief you don't yet know how to name. Give me the dream that feels too fragile to say out loud. Give me the burden you keep explaining away with a brave smile." There is a quiet truth that lives beneath the noise of our daily striving, a truth we often resist because it asks us to loosen our grip. That truth is this: you were never meant to carry everything alone. From the moment you first learned to stand, the world applauded self-reliance. It praised the strong back, the silent endurance, the ability to keep going even when your knees trembled. Somewhere along the way, strength was mistaken for solitude, and courage was confused with carrying pain in silence. But the human soul was not designed to be a warehouse for worry. We wake each morning already lifting invisible loads. Yesterday's regrets, today's responsibilities, tomorrow's fears. We gather them like stones and tuck them into our pockets, convincing ourselves that this is adulthood, this is faith, this is survival. And yet with every step the weight grows heavier, the smile becomes harder to hold. The breath shortens, the joy fades into a distant echo of what it once was. Still we say, "I can handle it." But listen closely. Exhaustion is not a failure of character. It is a signal of humanity. The heart knows when it is overburdened, long before the mouth is willing to confess it. Long before tears fall, the soul begins to ache. And it aches not because you are weak, but because you are trying to do what was never assigned to you. You were not created to manage every outcome, heal every wound, or predict every tomorrow. You were created to live, to love, to hope, and to trust. Control was never your calling. Faith was. There is something deeply sacred about admitting this is too much for me. It is not a declaration of defeat, it is a declaration of truth. And truth, when spoken, opens the door for grace. When you finally say, "I cannot carry this alone," you make room for God to do what only God can do. Too many people collapse not because life is unbearable, but because they try to bear it alone. We confuse responsibility with ownership. Yes, you are responsible for your choices, your effort, your integrity, but you are not the owner of outcomes. You do not command time. You do not control hearts. You do not decide how the story unfolds beyond your obedience and your faith. Yet we act as though the universe will unravel if we loosen our grip for even a moment, and so we hold on tight, tense, trembling. But clenched hands cannot receive blessings. God's invitation has always been gentle. Come unto me, not when you have it together, not when the answers are clear, but when you are weary, when you are burdened, when you have tried everything you know and still find yourself empty. There is a difference between strength and strain. Strength flows. Strain resists. Strength trusts. Strain controls. When you insist on carrying everything yourself, you are not proving your strength. You are practicing strain. And strain over time will break even the strongest among us. The truth is, many of us are not afraid of God's inability to handle our burdens. We are afraid of losing the illusion of control. We fear that if we stop holding everything together, it will fall apart. But what if the opposite is true? What if things begin to heal the moment you stop forcing them to stand? God does not ask you to drop your responsibilities. He asks you to drop the weight of pretending you are God. You were meant to partner with faith, not replace it. There is deep relief in knowing that the world will keep turning even when you rest, that the sun will rise even when you stop worrying, that God does not clock out when you fall asleep. While you are lying awake rehearsing worst-case scenarios, God is already present in the future you fear. Carrying everything alone makes the heart rigid. Trust makes it resilient. When you release the burden, you do not become careless, you become free. Free to breathe, free to listen, free to notice beauty again, free to experience joy without guilt, rest without anxiety, hope without conditions. And yes, the problems may still exist. The bills may still be due. The healing may still be in process. The answers may still be unfolding. But the difference is this: you are no longer carrying the weight of the world on your back. You are walking beside a God who has already proven his strength. There is no shame in needing help. Even the strongest trees bend toward the sun. Even the rivers depend on the rain. Even the earth itself rests. So why shouldn't there too? Letting go is not abandoning effort. It is aligning effort with faith. You do your part and you trust God with the rest. You take the step and you release the outcome. You plant the seed and you trust God with the harvest. You were never meant to carry everything alone. And the moment you accept that truth, something holy begins to happen. Your shoulders soften. Your breath deepens. Your spirit lifts. And in that quiet surrender, you realize that you have been held all along. There is a great misunderstanding that has traveled through generations, whispering lies into courageous hearts. It says that surrender is weakness, that letting go means losing, that faith is what remains after strength has failed. But this misunderstanding has cost us peace, because surrender, true surrender, is not the collapse of the spirit. It is the awakening of wisdom. Surrender is not the language of the defeated. It is the language of those who have learned where power truly lives. We are taught to stand firm, to fight, to push through at all costs. And there is dignity in perseverance, yes, but there is also danger in mistaking stubbornness for strength. Wisdom knows when to press forward and when to place the burden down. Wisdom understands that control is not courage and release is not retreat. To surrender is not to stop caring. It is to care deeply without trying to command what was never placed in your hands. There comes a moment when the soul recognizes its own limits. It is not a loud moment. It often arrives quietly in the middle of a long night, when the prayers have grown tired and the answers have not yet arrived. In that moment, the heart whispers, "I cannot do this alone." That whisper is not despair. It is discernment. Faith begins where control ends. Surrender asks for humility, and humility has never been weakness. Humility is the strength that knows it does not stand alone. It is the courage to say, "I trust God more than I trust my fear." It is the wisdom to acknowledge that while you can influence the journey, you do not dictate the destination. When you surrender, you are not shrinking yourself. You are expanding your trust. Many resist surrender because they imagine it as passivity, as sitting still while life happens to them. But surrender is an active choice. It is a decision made daily, sometimes hourly, to release the illusion that you must manage everything for life to work. It is waking up and saying, "I will do what I can, and I will trust God with what I cannot." That is not weakness. That is clarity. Surrender does not mean abandoning responsibility. It means abandoning anxiety. It means stepping out of the role of savior and returning to the role of servant. It means recognizing that you are a participant in the story, not the author of every chapter. There is a deep exhaustion that comes from trying to be God in your own life, from attempting to orchestrate every detail, predict every outcome, protect every heart. And there is a deep peace that arrives when you finally stop. Wisdom knows the difference. When you surrender, you are not saying, "I give up." You are saying, "I give it to God." And there is a universe of difference between those two declarations. One is rooted in fear, the other is rooted in trust. Fear says, "If I don't hold this together, it will fall apart." Faith says, "Even if it falls apart, God will hold me." There is bravery in letting go of certainty. There is maturity in trusting what you cannot see. Surrender teaches the soul how to rest without guilt and hope without proof. Those who surrender wisely are not those who avoid pain. They are those who no longer let pain define their decision. They understand that suffering is not always a sign of failure, and struggle is not always a call to control. Sometimes struggle is an invitation to trust more deeply. Surrender aligns the heart with reality. It tells the truth: you are finite and God is not. You are learning and God is knowing. You are becoming and God already is. And in that alignment there is freedom. Control keeps the spirit tight and restless. Surrender loosens the knots. Control asks, what if? Surrender asks, what now? Control exhausts. Surrender restores. There is nothing lazy about trusting God. Trust requires patience, and patience is work of the highest order. It requires waiting without bitterness, hoping without guarantee, loving without possession. Surrender is the discipline of faith. It is choosing peace over panic, wisdom over worry, humility over pride. It is accepting that God's timing may not match your urgency, but it will always surpass your understanding. And yes, surrender will test you. It will ask you to release plans you worked hard to build, timelines you carefully constructed, expectations you carried like sacred vows. But surrender never takes without purpose. What it removes in control, it replaces in peace. When you surrender, you are not becoming smaller, you are becoming lighter. You walk with less tension in your shoulders and less noise in your mind. You learn how to listen instead of rush, how to respond instead of react. You begin to see doors you would have missed while forcing others open. Wisdom teaches us that strength does not always roar. Sometimes it bows. Sometimes it kneels. Sometimes it opens its hands and says, I trust you. And in that open-handed posture, life begins to flow again. Not according to your demands, but according to a divine rhythm that knows where you are going even when you do not. Surrender is not weakness. It is the quiet confidence that God is who He says He is. And when you live from that truth, you discover a strength that does not depend on control, a courage that does not fear uncertainty, and a peace that remains even when the path is unclear. There is a reassurance the soul longs for in moments of fear, a certainty that rises like a quiet prayer when the ground beneath us feels unsteady. It is the knowing that whatever we carry, every worry, every wound, every unanswered question, can be held by hands stronger than our own. Not imagined hands, not distant hands, but the living, sustaining hands of God. The hands of God are not fragile. They do not tremble under pressure. They do not grow weary at the weight of human sorrow. These are the hands that shaped mountains and measured oceans, that set stars in their places and taught the dawn how to rise. And yet with all that power they remain gentle enough to cradle a broken heart. This is the miracle we often forget. The same God who governs the universe stoops low enough to carry you. We look at our burdens and assume they are too heavy, too complicated, too tangled for anyone else to manage. We name them impossible and decide they must be endured alone. But God has never been intimidated by complexity. God has never been overwhelmed by magnitude. What overwhelms us does not overwhelm Him. Your fear does not frighten God. Your past does not embarrass God. Your uncertainty does not confuse God. When you place your burden in God's hands, you are not adding to His load. You are stepping into His design. Too often we measure God by our limitations. We imagine that because we are exhausted, God must be too. Because we cannot see a way forward, God must be uncertain. But God's strength does not diminish with use. The more He carries, the more His faithfulness is revealed. There is no hierarchy of burdens in God's hands. No worry is dismissed as too small. No pain is judged as insignificant. The quiet tears shed in the dark matter just as much as the cries heard in public. God does not weigh your suffering against someone else's and tell you to endure in silence. He simply says, bring it. Bring the heartbreak you cannot explain. Bring the fear you pretend not to feel. Bring the dream that scares you because it matters so much. God's hands are strong enough to hold all of it at once. We sometimes think we must clean ourselves up before we approach God, as if His hands require perfection. But God has never asked for polish. He has always welcomed honesty. The hands that formed humanity from dust are not afraid of mess. They are skilled in restoration. When life presses hard against you, when you feel like you are slipping through your own fingers, remember this. You are not falling away from God. You are falling into Him. There is safety in those hands, not the kind of safety that promises a life without storms, but the kind that promises you will not be lost in them. God does not always remove the storm, but He always steadies the one standing in it. Think of how many times you have survived what you once believed would destroy you. Think of how often strength appeared only after you admitted you had none left. That was not coincidence. That was not luck. That was God holding you when you could no longer hold yourself. The hands of God do not rush the process. They are patient with your becoming. They understand that healing takes time, that trust grows slowly, that faith sometimes arrives trembling. God does not drop what He holds. He does not lose track of your story. He does not forget the promises He has spoken over your life. And even when you forget them, He remembers. There is deep comfort in knowing that God's hands are not only strong but steady. They do not grip in panic. They do not tighten in fear. They hold with purpose. They guide with intention. They carry without complaint. We often try to manage pain by controlling outcomes, but pain does not yield to control. It yields to care. And no one cares for you with greater devotion than God. His hands do not merely support, they shape. They mold sorrow into wisdom, endurance into compassion, wounds into testimony. When you place your life in God's hands, you are placing it in the hands of a master creator. Nothing is wasted there. Not the waiting, not the struggle, not the tears. Every fragment becomes part of something meaningful. You may not see the full picture while you are being held. You may only feel the ache of the moment, the uncertainty of the next step. But God sees the entire canvas. He knows where this chapter leads, even when the page feels heavy. Letting God hold your burdens does not make you passive. It makes you protected. It does not erase responsibility. It redistributes weight. You still walk, you still choose, you still try, but you do so without the crushing pressure of thinking everything depends on you, because it doesn't stuck. God's hands are strong enough to hold your family, your future, your unanswered prayers, and your fragile hope all at the same time. You do not need to ration your trust or withhold your fears. There is room. And when you finally rest in that truth, when you stop clutching what was never meant to be carried alone, something inside you exhales, the shoulders lower, the heart softens. The spirit remembers what it feels like to be supported. You are not too much for God's hands. Your life is not too broken. Your story is not too complicated. There comes a season in every life when understanding feels like a language we no longer speak. The questions line up, patient and persistent, while the answers remain silent. In that space, faith is tested, not by suffering alone, but by uncertainty. It is one thing to trust God when the road is clear and the signs are bright. It is another thing entirely to trust when the path dissolves into shadow and the silence grows loud. Yet this is where faith finds its deepest roots. Trusting God does not begin with comprehension. It begins with relationship. Long before you understood how the world worked, you trusted the hands that held you. You trusted before you could explain, before you could analyze, before you could predict. Faith asks you to return to that posture, not childish, but childlike. Not ignorant, but open. Understanding is a gift, but it is not a prerequisite for trust. We live in a time that demands explanations. We want timelines, reasons, guarantees. We want God to show us the full map before we take the first step. But faith was never meant to operate with full visibility. It was designed to move forward on promise, not proof. God does not owe us explanations, but He offers us His presence. There are moments when heaven feels quiet, when prayers echo back unanswered, when waiting stretches longer than your strength. In those moments, it is tempting to believe that silence means abandonment. But silence in the language of God often means work. Deep, unseen, purposeful work. Seeds grow in silence. Healing often begins in stillness. Transformation rarely announces itself. Just because you cannot hear God does not mean He is not near. Just because you cannot see the outcome does not mean there is no intention behind the delay. Trust asks you to believe that God is active even when He is not audible. There is a difference between not knowing and being alone. God never confuses the two. When you trust without understanding, you are not ignoring reality. You are acknowledging a greater one. You are saying, I do not see the whole picture, but I trust the one who does. That trust does not erase fear, but it gives fear a place to rest. It does not silence questions, but it keeps them from becoming accusations. Faith says, I will walk even when I cannot see the road. Fear says, I cannot move until I know what sets us ahead. Trust chooses movement. There will be days when trusting God feels like walking with closed eyes, guided only by the sound of His voice remembered from better days. On those days, memory becomes sacred. You remember what God has already done. You remember the doors that opened unexpectedly, the strength that arrived just in time, the peace that settled when logic failed. Remembrance is faith's anchor. Trusting God when you do not understand also means releasing the need to explain yourself to everyone else. It means accepting that obedience may not always make sense to onlookers. That your choices, guided by faith, may look foolish to those who require certainty before courage. But faith has never been popular with fear. There is a quiet bravery in saying, I don't know how this will turn out, but I know who I trust. That bravery is not loud. It does not demand attention. It simply keeps going. Trust does not mean you will not grieve. It does not mean disappointment will never visit your door. It means that when those things arrive, they do not have the final word. Trust places pain in a larger story, one that God is still writing. We often mistake understanding for control. We believe that if we can explain it, we can manage it. But life has a way of humbling that belief. No amount of understanding can prevent loss. No explanation can shield you from change. Control is fragile. Trust is resilient. When you trust God, you accept that uncertainty is not your enemy. It is the environment where faith grows. Muscles strengthen under resistance, roots deepen in darkness. Faith matures in mystery. God is not offended by your questions. He is not threatened by your confusion. He does not withdraw when you wrestle with doubt. He stays, He listens, He waits. And sometimes He lets you walk without answers so you can learn to walk with Him. Trusting God when you don't understand requires patience, and patience reshapes the soul. It slows the rush to judgment. It softens the edges of fear. It teaches you to live in the present moment, instead of constantly borrowing trouble from the future. Faith does not demand that you feel confident. It asks that you remain willing to keep praying even when words feel thin, willing to keep hoping even when evidence is scarce. Willing to believe that God's timing is not careless even when it feels late. There will come a day, perhaps quietly, perhaps suddenly, when clarity arrives, and when it does, you may realize that what confused you was protecting you, that what delayed you was preparing you, that what hurt you was shaping you. But even if clarity does not come in the way you expect, trust will still have done its work. It will have kept your heart open instead of hardened, your spirit soft instead of bitter. To trust God without understanding is to choose relationship over resolution. It is to believe that God's character matters more than your circumstances, that His faithfulness does not depend on your clarity. And so you walk on not because you know the ending, but because you trust the author. Not because the road is easy, but because the one who walks beside you is sure. That is faith. That is trust. That is courage. There is a quiet miracle that occurs when the soul finally loosens its grip. It does not announce itself with thunder or demand applause. It arrives softly, like dawn easing into the night, like breath returning after a long season of holding it in. Letting go does not feel dramatic at first. It feels unfamiliar. But within that unfamiliarity lives freedom. So many of us have been taught that control is safety. We hold tightly to plans, to people, to expectations, believing that vigilance will protect us from pain. We stay alert, braced, prepared for disappointment. And over time we forget what it feels like to rest. The body may sit still, but the spirit remains clenched. Letting go is the unlearning of that tension. When you release what you cannot control, you do not become careless, you become present. You stop living 10 steps ahead, rehearsing tragedies that have not yet arrived. You stop punishing yourself with futures that exist only in your fear. And in that release, peace begins. Not the fragile peace that depends on everything going right, but the deep peace that knows how to stay even when things go wrong. Peace is not the absence of trouble. It is the presence of trust. Letting go is an act of faith that says, I will no longer exhaust myself trying to play God. It is admitting that your constant worrying has never once added a day to your life, never once solved a problem before its time. It is recognizing that anxiety is not preparation. It is punishment for a future that may never come. When you let go, you give your nervous system permission to rest. You give your heart permission to feel joy without suspicion. You give your spirit permission to hope again. And hope is a powerful thing. Spiritual freedom does not mean your life becomes simple. It means your soul becomes spacious. You stop carrying resentment like a badge of honor. You stop replaying old conversations wishing you had spoken differently. You stop gripping regret as though suffering were a form of loyalty to the past. Freedom asks you to forgive. Not because the wound was small, but because your life is too valuable to be lived in chains. Letting go teaches you how to walk lightly in a heavy world. It teaches you that you can care deeply without being consumed, that you can love fully without trying to possess, that you can work diligently without tying your worth to outcomes. There is a strength that emerges when you stop resisting what you cannot change. It is the strength of adaptability, of grace, of resilience. It is the strength that bends without breaking, that rests without guilt, that trusts without proof. When you release control, you discover a surprising truth. God has been steady all along. The ground does not disappear beneath you. The world does not collapse. Instead, you find yourself supported in ways you did not anticipate. Letting go opens the door to healing. Healing does not rush. It moves at the pace of honesty. It requires you to stop pretending that you are fine when you are not. It asks you to sit with your pain long enough to understand it, but not so long that it becomes your identity. When you let go, healing is no longer something you chase. It is something you allow. God works most freely in open hands. Spiritual freedom also changes how you see yourself. You stop measuring your worth by productivity alone. You stop believing that rest must be earned through exhaustion. You begin to understand that your value was established long before your achievements ever spoke. Freedom reminds you that you are loved not for what you do, but for who you are. There is a quiet confidence that grows in a free spirit. You no longer feel the need to prove yourself to everyone. You listen more than you argue. You choose peace more often than pride. You learn that walking away can sometimes be the bravest act of all. Letting go sharpens discernment. When your hands are no longer full of fear, they are free to receive wisdom. You begin to notice which battles are yours to fight and which are yours to release. You learn that not every door needs to be forced. Not every silence needs to be filled. Not every disappointment needs to be explained. Some things heal simply because you stop reopening the wound. Spiritual freedom does not erase responsibility, but it redefines it. You still show up. You still try. You still care. But you no longer believe that everything depends on you. You partner with God instead of competing with Him. And in that partnership, joy returns. Joy that is not reckless but rooted. Joy that is not loud but lasting. Joy that survives disappointment because it was never built on circumstances alone. Letting go does not make you passive. It makes you aligned. You move with life instead of constantly pushing against it. You learn how to trust the pauses, how to respect the waiting, how to recognize that growth often happens underground. Freedom teaches patience. It teaches compassion. It teaches you to extend grace to yourself when you fall short. There is a holy lightness in a soul that trusts God completely. Not because life is easy, but because fear no longer sits at the center. Love does. Faith does. Hope does. And when you live from that place, you realize that letting go was never about loss. It was about release. Release from constant tension. Release from self-blame. Release from the exhausting need to control the uncontrollable. Letting go leads you back to yourself, stronger, calmer, freer than you have been in a long time.